threat of environmental degradation. Not that it ever worked for everyone. Despite Rousseau's aspirations for universality, it has always had its exclusions linked to age, gender, sexuality, criminal status, poverty, ethnicity, and impairment. But the mass movement of people over the past 20 years is set to increase and calls for a new social settlement, a revised social contract from organisations such as the UN, gain ever greater purchase. What form should that take? In this paper, I will think with Michel Serres, Natural Contract, as this necessitates attention not just to human conflict, but also the more than human relations in which these are embedded. It offers an imaginarium that includes the social and geological, animals and plants, seas and weather, that addresses the exclusions of the social whilst taking account of life as always more than human. In this paper, I will consider the natural contract and how it fosters an understanding of Bergsjo's social settlement in contrast to that of current Swedish discourse. This is a work of field philosophy, or the situated deliberation of ideas, that includes ethnographic fieldwork in Bergsjo and a conversation with a migrant social work practitioner whom I will refer to as Humza. Next slide, please. While Bergsjo neighbourhood and its people are categorised as vulnerable, it was simultaneously viewed widely in public discourse as a no-go zone where crime, shooting and the oppression of women is commonplace. The main thrust of political action is inclusion, how to incorporate migrants into the normative view of Swedish society. From left and right, migrant areas in the police list are widely viewed as outside of the Swedish social settlement and in need of inclusion, either by force or through education and welfare. Humza described the biggest conflict as one prosecuted by white privileged people who have never been to Bergsjo against those who live there. You can run with the next couple, thank you. Humza delights in the specificities of Bergsjo, its forest and lake, wild berries and mushrooms, hares and squirrels. The expansive green parks where children gather to play, the idiosyncrasies of each small neighbourhood within Bergsjo, and that you can quickly assemble a football match with people you've never met before. Next. On the downside, there is the violence that erupts rarely, but is ever present in the form of a police helicopter that patrols most nights, and the pervasive sense of exclusion. Bergsjo is not like neighbourhoods typical of Gothenburg. It is why Humza lives there, and he reckons most of the other people whose nationalities conjure to mind the conflicts that they fled: the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and more recently Somalia. These are the people designated both vulnerable and threatening on the police list, people whose presence challenges Sweden's social contract. The current conflict within Swedish society around the suburbs, like all human conflict, cannot be separated from the materiality of life, the necessity of food, water and shelter. However, in the era of Anthropocene, humanity is confronted by its dependence on a world that includes the vitality of trees and rivers, ocean and wildlife, soil and rocks. And from another vantage point, technologies such as artificial intelligence that will impact human lives in ways that we have not yet begun to imagine. The world of things requires a reconsideration of the Enlightenment social contract as the basis of politics. Despite the differences between social contract theorists, Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke and Rawls, they share a human exceptionalism that is blind to other than human relations. Michel Serres, the French philosopher of science, recognises the leverage of the social contract, but criticises it in all its forms as a mechanism that is based on a division between human and nature that has led to the exploitation of both human and non-human. In its place, he offers the natural contract that calls humanity to listen to the things of the world and consider what language they speak. Serres' natural contract attends to the more than human relations and the laws that are configured through these relations rather than imposed upon them. In the following, I will consider the ways in which Serres' critique of the social contract and proposition of the natural contract fosters a different understanding of Bergsjo, one that attends to more than human relations. I will discuss the three facets of his criticism, where they are found in Bergsjo, and what he proposes in place. Following this, I will draw conclusions on the challenges of adopting the natural contract, but the necessity to do so. Next slide. Goya's painting, Fight with Cudgels, is the emblem that Serre chose for his book, The Natural Contract. These battling figures are so preoccupied with the war between them that they fail to observe the shared destruction that awaits them both in the quicksand beneath their feet. It evokes the absurdity of humans so preoccupied with human interests that they become blind and ignorant to the non-human relations within which they are created and destroyed. Serre defies the social contract that builds on Cartesian enlightenment with its focus on mastery and property as a mechanism that obscures the relations of the more than human world to human sensibility. He goes further and says, human culture abhors the world, and that our imaginary maintains, quote, only conflicts or debates thick with humanity and purified of things, end quote. He refers to this as mute world and states, quote, we have lost the world. We've transformed things into fetishes or commodities. The stakes of our stratagems and our acosmic philosophies for almost half a century now have been holding forth only in language or politics, writing or logic. Close quote. The natural contract recenters the material laws of order and disorder that do not belong to humanity but extend through human life. These relational laws have always been, as they are the basis of life. But the problem, according to Serre, is that enlightenment and its artifice of the social contract has eclipsed them. The social contract is the enlightenment gift of social order that enabled humanity to contemplate a social consensus that is not dependent on a transcendent divinity, but agreement with a sovereign on the terms of social order. As such, it is celebrated as a move towards a rational society that is not caught in the grips of Hobbes' war of all against all. Notwithstanding its enduring power, Serre points to the limitations and forms of destruction that it has brought, not just for humanity, but to the non-human. Serre rejects the social contract, first, as it reduces through a blindness to difference. Second, it creates a partition between humanity and the material world of complex relations, and in doing so becomes a mechanism of destruction, a device that forgets nature. Third, it exploits as it takes what belongs to the state of nature as its own. For Serre, the social contract that has muted the world is not just responsible for the parasitic exploitation of humans seen to exist outside its bonds, but also the land, the seas, rivers and plants and animals. In its place, he calls for the natural contract. The natural contract is not premised on the imposition of a human diktat, but on connecting with the material laws of things worked out through relations. It eschews the centralizing and limited sovereign in favour of decentralized relational bonds. The natural contract is not an instrument to be signed any more than the social contract. It is an intuition, a way of making sense of formulating problems. Serre's tripartite critique of the social contract enables a new way to understand the conflicts around Bergsjo and the premise of the natural contract, a means of articulating more than human relations. We can see when anything it's one that's good. So first says Serre claims that instead of the reduction of the natural contract, we should have difference. So according to Serre, the first shift of the social contract is to reduce. In Petit Poucet, he states, nature, according to the moderns, is reduced to human nature, which is reduced to reason. The world no longer has any place there. Close quote. Serre castigates the ways in which science has made nature its domain with an expectation that reason will tame complexity. This is evident in the discourse around Bergsjo. Terms such as suburbs, migrants, and the notoriety of place names, Rinkeby, Rosengard, Vivala, and of course Bergsjo, flatten these complex socio-material ecologies and reform them through the prism of vulnerability and threat deployed by the police list. Differences in the way in which their social history, built environment, geologies, zoologies, and herbologies create varied ways of living, different forms of relation and different problems all become invisible. Even the Million Homes programme that generated a diverse range of housing is narrowed into a singular meaning. This reduction does not take place through words. Hamza spoke of the experience of being reduced within mainstream Swedish society. He said, I have chose to be here because I feel more comfort, because when I go outside, there are a lot of people looking at me. I don't feel I am the one who has black hair, you know, and this feeling, I think a lot of people feels like that here. It's mixed. Hamza describes how characteristics such as black hair are refined to a singular meaning. When he's in areas where there are predominantly ethnic Swedes, this racializing reduction of a singular feature is found in Aron Salvana's bioscopic gaze. This is a racism that is so deeply embedded in the world views of those who hold it that is evoked by the colour of hair or eyes and tone of skin. It is a reductive border that sees all on the other side as the same. This flattening is a means of managing the incomprehensible meshwork that is life and producing a false certainty. Serre reinstates the middle, the messy relational mangle that human exceptionalism has erased. In doing so, he embraces difference. He calls this cacophonous difference noise. Next slide, please. Noise, he says, bathes the whole scene and comes from who knows where. It is the intimacy of living bodies immersed in the mass. Noise is the rumbling world of myriad alliances being made and unmade. In his book Genesis, he says, the raucous, anarchic, noisy, variegated, tiger-striped, zebra street, jumbled up, mixed up, multiple, crisscrossed by myriad colours and myriad shades, is possibility itself. It is a set of possible things. It may be the set of possible things. Noise is the undifferentiated chaos within which all possibles are found. Noise is unlocalizable. It is the clamour which surrounds the endless trading of place, where it becomes impossible to clearly differentiate one thing from another. Noise has no borders. It is not a matter of phenomenology, so it is a matter of being itself. Serre says it settles in subjects as well as in objects. It is the ensemble of possible profiles, the sum of horizons. According to Serre, Descartes looks for, quote, the smooth and decisive simplicity of certitude. He prunes the bifurcation, he trims the stroke and gets back on the right track, close quote. And in doing this, he silences the noise. At the end of his essay, La Belle Noiseuse, Serre calls the reader to listen. His philosophy seeks to recover the noise and in doing so replace the certainty of division with the uncertainty of multiple chaotically connected possibles. The noise of Ballyhoon can be heard in multiple ways. Hamza articulates this as an exposure to difference that is creative. Hamza says, there is all this kind of poverty, but Ballyhoon is very special, where you have a place with so many different cultures, and growing up in that is a big, big, big gift. So I know a lot of people has become, you know, artists and writers, and you know, they say it's because we were growing up in a place like Ballyhoon or Hammarkullen or Rinkeby, Tensta, because we were growing up with, we just learned to accept that people are different, and that's normal. Hamza articulates the contradictions of Ballyhoon. He is fully aware of what it is to live with poverty and violence. He is aware of the racism and what he calls internalized racism experienced by many people who live there. And yet for him to live there is a big, big, big gift. And the crux of this gift is that difference is to be accepted and explored, not managed or reduced. I witnessed this as I wandered through Ballyhoon streets and paths. Women dressed in full burqa would turn from their Arab conversation to shout "Hey do" to their hot pant guard Swedish friends. Children playing in the playground also switch between languages. Corin, an ethnic Swede, lives in Ballyhoon but grew up in Tensta, a Stockholm suburb also on the police list, said that she could not live in other mainstream ethnic Swedish areas of Gothenburg as they're too constrained. The different cultural practices operating side by side in Ballyhoon make it impossible to discern any definitive norms. Authorities worry that people are not integrating into Swedish society, and yet the level of integration evident in the streets and squares is unquestionable compared with the neighbourhoods populated with ethnic Swedes. It's hard to imagine standing out in Bergsjo. So Serre's second critique, he offers parasitism in place of division. Serre's second critique of the social contract is that it divides. Hobbes' Leviathan was a move to stop the war of all against all through adherence to a shared agreement on how to live. Those who can and do conform to this agreement are included in this social settlement, leaving all else outside. You are in civil society or out. Those who can agree to this contract are protected by it, and those who cannot are outside in the state of nature. You are bios, politicized life, or zoe, the state of nature. Since Hannah Arendt's deliberation on the plight of refugees following the Second World War, this form of division is much discussed in regard to those fleeing their countries. As stateless people, they expose the limits of a social contract linked to nation states. Currently in the UK, we use the language of boats instead of people to describe those seeking asylum on our shores, as the people in the boats do not have status within the UK social settlement. Similar forms of othering occur in the Swedish media about refugees and asylum seekers. The police list fulfills a function in separating migrant neighbourhoods as set apart from Swedish society. A number of scholars have explored this form of exclusion. Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer and Rancière's La Part des Sans Part. This work offers important insight into the exclusionary operations of the dominant human social settlement. Serre goes far beyond this and argues that the first division was with nature, that setting nature apart allowed the human divisions to follow. Hamza refers to the mainstream perception of Bergsjo residents as savages who need saved. This is made possible by the innate belief in the state of nature that sits outside of civil society. In the social contract, Serre states, nature lies outside the collectivity, which is why the state of nature remains incomprehensible to the language invented in and by society, or that invents social man, close quote. The social contract excludes all that is limited, grammar cannot render rational and manageable. It produces subjects in its image divided from the world. Sorry, I lost my place. Serre's division does not exist in the material world, where instead of partitions, Serre discerns chains of dependence. This is Serre's ontological parasitism, not an exploitative parasitism, but interdependence. This operates at every level, from the bacteria that live from human guts, to the unborn child reliant on its mother, to the domestication of bees by flowers. In this schema, all forms of being become possible through participation in parasitic webs. All play host and parasite, all give and receive hospitality. Nature does not exist outside of human life, as human life is inextricably linked to plants and soil, animals and water. There is an abundance of examples of ontological parasitism in Bergsjo. The hares and squirrels that live in the woodland are a constant reminder of the connection between plants and trees that they rely on to live. The people foraging in the forest know that they need to care as they search so that there are plants and fungi for future visits. Hamza described other forms of parasitism when he talked of Bergsjo Lake. He says, "It's one of the safest places I have been. When you're there, it's kind of everyone. It means so much for everybody. So everybody's respecting the place and each other, you know what I mean? So people take care of you, each other's kids, people sharing food and people sharing their barbecue place. You know, if I go to barbecue in Bergsjo, I don't bring my own fire with me. I just bring the food. And then I can go and ask a person who's already barbecuing, oh, it's usual, you know, can I barbecue my meat? Yeah, come on and barbecue also. And sometimes, you know, change and like that, you know, and everybody's swimming there and people watching each other's kids. And when I swim, I always bring my bag and I just ask someone and just look after my bag and go and swim. And people do like that because it's a safe place. At Bergsjo Lake, the bathers are parasites to the lake and to each other. But this is a parasitism built around sharing, not exploitation. The lake is an object that generates relations, not just the fish, plant, and microbial communities that exchange the role of host with water. But the lake also generates communities that include people. The barbecue fulfills the same function. Serre calls such community-generating objects quasi-objects. The quasi-object, when passed, makes the collective. If it stops, it makes the individual. The lake weaves a community. Quasi-objects systematically blur the distinction between subject and object. The laws that order the lake community are not given as transcendent decree, but are produced through the process of their making. So Serre's third critique: symbiosis in place of exploitation. Serre's third criticism of the social contract is perhaps most damning. In his celebrated book, Le Parasite, Serre argues that reduction and division pave the way to exploitation, where the dominant order takes with impunity from all that sits outside it, whether that is human life deemed to have no value or land and animals. The invidious logic of reduction and partition makes it possible to exploit the soil for its nutrients, the cattle for meat and milk, and pollute the seas and rivers with our waste because they have been assigned to the state of nature. All assigned to the state of nature can be exploited by that which is not. When I visited, it was election time in Sweden, and many politicians exploit the situation of migrant people to bolster their campaign claims to reinstate Swedish values through limiting, returning, and educating migrants. Alert to this, Hamza points out the other forms of exploitation that they ignore. Election in Sweden, and you can hear it everywhere, you know. You can just read in all the pictures that are around in the cities through the number one question is crime. You know, when they're talking about criminality, everybody knows which kind of criminality they're talking about. They're not talking about these big criminal, you know, the companies who are taking millions and millions of money and putting them in the bank outside of the country. You know, this kind of cheating, you know, that we talk about, the big monies. You have IKEA, Coca-Cola, you have McDonald's, all of them, they've been documented. Everybody knows they're doing, that they're putting their money in different kinds of strange bank system in the world and putting back. And it just goes around the system to avoid paying tax. Politicians parasite upon the migrant areas as they use them as a focus that obscures other forms of parasitism. For Serres, it is those with most power who are the biggest parasites. However, Serre does not argue that parasitism can be avoided, as discussed below, as discussed above. All relations involve taking and giving. Serre looks at the symbiosis that exists outside of the social contract. He says, we must add to the exclusively social contract a natural contract of symbiosis and reciprocity, in which our relationship to things would set aside mastery and possession in favour of admiring attention, reciprocity, contemplation, and respect. Symbiosis starts with the recognition of difference that interconnects across space and time in complex and unfathomable ways. This starting point is crucial, as the natural contract, like the social contract, is not a document to be signed, but an orientation to the world, an intuition. Simons says that this is about the inclusion of things in our politics. How we do this is by giving attention to things that communicate. Serre says, the earth speaks to us in terms of forces, bonds, and interactions, and that's enough to make a contract. So attention to difference, to the multiple possibles sustained within these forces, bonds, and interactions is the first move. Second, that as all benefit from these relations, so a debt is owed, and he sets this out in the second half of the statement. Each of the partners in symbiosis thus owes by rights life to the other on pain of death. This symbiotic intuition is not a transactional exchange, but an act of giving to the world as the world has given. Hamza describes such an intuition at Bergsjo Lake. He goes there with an orientation to the world, with the expectation that others will give where they can. There is no contract to be signed. But this orientation to the world, according to Serre, leads to what Watkins refers to as a sense of modification of behaviour that promotes symbiotic existence, close quote. This is a contract negotiated through interaction with the forces of the world. Just as Uxgall's flower becomes bee-like and bee flower-like, so any course navigated in response to forces, bonds, and interactions through adaptation. Adaptations are produced through the ways that things combine in particular ways, not just being together. Also, symbiotic relations are not necessarily equal, and their impacts that leak in different directions cannot be controlled or even known. This is perhaps the point, that there can be no vantage point of control that belongs to the paradigm of the social contract and its sovereign. What Serre calls the beneficial chains of symbiosis, instead of going back in time towards the past, towards the same people, it advances towards the future and spreads out to unknown others. It is decentralized and uncertain contract, always in negotiation and always fragile. At the end of the social contract, Serre states, "Who am I? A tremor of nothingness living in a permanent earthquake." The natural contract does not offer certitude as it reinstates human life in the chaos of life itself. Symbiosis is no utopia, but for Serre, it is not just a route to limit the harms of the social contract, but a necessary reinstatement of the world in our politics. Hamza, and just to conclude, Hamza is fully aware of the challenges of living in neighbourhoods. He knows the impact of poverty, crime, and exclusion from the dominant politics. However, he does not see Ballyhoon as a problem to be solved. Ballyhoon offers Hamza a way of living that is much more hospitable to people like him, young men with black hair and Arabic names. He finds this a place that has an orientation to difference, an openness to change, a way of living that is grounded in place. This contrasts with neighbourhoods dominated by ethnic Swedes where possibilities of living are much more rigid, and rather than expectation of its gifts, there is a suspicion of difference. Perhaps it is this sense of exclusion that has precipitated a more natural form of settlement in Ballyhoon. It is impossible to imagine that this could occur without the forceful presence of trees and lake, wildlife and plants that precipitate connections. This orientation to Ballyhoon through Serre natural contract does not provide answers to the problems. This would fundamentally undermine its premise. What it does is to alter the intuition of Ballyhoon and position it not as a place to fix, but a place to learn from. How do people, trees and animals and water share this space in such an ungoverned way? How much are Ballyhoon's creative gifts tied to the fragile, uncertain status of all? What would a community of practice based on listening to the noise in place of intervention look like? Thank you. Need it.